Hey everybody, Travis here at SILCA, back with the second installment of the Road to Emporia series. Uh, we mentioned bringing on a coach, and I think that's probably the first place that we want to start is the training. So um, I have raced a little bit, mostly the local criteriums and velodrome, and done a few long rides here and there, but the kind of ultra endurance gravel stuff is new to me. So I thought who better than to bring on than YouTube personality, coach, professional gravel racer, Dylan Johnson. So he's actually going to be coaching me through this whole process. So we're going to get into training, nutrition, pacing, all sorts of exciting topics on the race. So welcome Dylan Johnson to the Road to Emporia series, and here's my conversation with Dylan. Alrighty, well, thanks Dylan for joining us today. Kind of going on this crazy crazy journey that I'm going to try to do. So for those who don't know, Dylan is a SILCA athlete, coach, professional gravel racer, ultra endurance mountain bike, and anything else I'm missing?
I think that was perfect.
All right, and he's actually. He's the first one I decided when I was going to do this Unbound project to reach out to and see if he might be able to give me a little bit of help with the training and take me from the out of shape dad to Unbound finisher. So jump right in and I guess just kind of a baseline of where I'm at, where I'm trying to go. I think that helps a lot. I was just looking back through my Training Peaks files before our call. I think I've averaged this year about a little less than 3 hours a week. So to go and do a 200-mile gravel race, I got a little work to do. So we're going to jump through training, marginal gains, everything that we can do to try to get there. So,
yeah.
So I think kind of my goal is to finish this thing kind of at all costs, but hopefully get under 14 hours, and I think 12 hours somewhere in there will beat the sunlight, and I think that's a pretty good goal for me. And we get this a lot from a lot of our listeners and customers that they're not at the pointy end of the race like you, so they just want to finish it, and so we thought maybe it'd be a good idea to document it. So. I guess as we're going in the training side of things, what's the rough outline look like, you think, from we're recording this in October? What's it look like from here until June 3rd?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that a lot of athletes are in your position when it comes to Unbound. Maybe they were fast back in the day, or maybe they've just recently picked up cycling, but regardless, they've got a job, they've got a family, they've got other responsibilities. They can't dedicate 30 hours a week to riding their bike, and they're trying to get to the finish of Unbound as fast as they can, or just not have a completely terrible time out there, actually feel good during the race. And, I think that this is a good experiment to run, right? Because it's kind of what so many athletes are dealing with. So I think that's cool. So I guess your big goal would be to finish under 12 hours, correct? And then if we can't make 12 hours, it would be really nice to at least not have to put lights on your bike and finish before the sun goes down.
I don't have any plans on bringing lights. Maybe that's poor planning on my part, but maybe it'll be a little extra motivation in the last part of the race. So really it's a finish at all costs. And, I think maybe putting some time to it gives me a little bit more on the nutrition side, on the training side. What am I looking at? So I don't care as much about the number. If I could finish it in 4 hours, that'd be great. And then I'm done. Then I'm done with the race.
Sure. Well, I will say that the finishing, what finishing time is reasonable depends on a couple of different factors that are out of your control. One being the course that they pick, because Unbound is not the same course every year, and depending on which direction they choose, the course could actually be quite a bit harder. For example, last year the course went south. Going south is, usually the easier direction. That's why that's part of the reason why times were so fast. If they choose the north direction, I mean, it could very easily add 30 minutes to an hour to your time.
Yeah.
Just because the terrain is rougher up there. The other thing is the weather could play a big factor. Most of the time it's pretty hot, but for example, this past year it was not hot. It was actually raining. And you would think that the rain would make the times slower, but I think the reason why the times were so fast was because the rain just kept things cool. Like, it didn't get out of the 70s, and you were being rained on. You weren't overheating. Yeah. Overheating is usually a huge issue with Unbound, and if it's really hot, again, that could easily add an hour to your time. When people have these time goals for Unbound, it's important to keep that in mind, that like those two factors that I just laid out, and that's not taking into account getting a flat tire or, I don't know, your nutrition screwing up or whatever. Those two factors right there are completely out of your control and could completely, bump you out of the time that you want to get. So, I think that's just important to keep in mind with that race. It's not the same course every year. It's not the same conditions every year. So
maybe we'll keep lights at the second sag. Throw them on if we're going a little slower.
Yeah. So I guess let's talk about what from a training perspective, what the next what is it? 3/4 of a year should look like leading up to the race, or is it half a year at this point?
I think 6-7 months. 7 months.
Yeah. So, I think the way that we typically periodize training is we would start with an off-season period, and the off-season period is actually important. It's not necessarily a time to just screw around and do whatever you want, although I do kind of recommend doing that on the bike. Just have fun on the bike at that time. But the biggest purpose of the off-season is to get in some weight training and get used to that weight training, so that when you get to increasing the volume on the bike or increasing the intensity on the bike, you can handle doing that with your weight training. Because if you are already doing a high volume of training on the bike or a high intensity of training on the bike or both, and you just add weightlifting into that out of nowhere, you're not going to be able to walk. So I think we had a brief discussion about this, but are you interested in adding weight training to your program, or do you think that you just don't have enough time for that in your schedule?
Yeah, I think I think I'm game for just about anything I can fit in that's going to make this happen. So my background is in crit racing poorly and and some velodrome racing at a low level. So
the opposite of Unbound.
Yes, the exact opposite. So I've done a couple gravel races and had a blast, and I actually got to come out last year to Unbound and was at the race all day and sitting out in the rain, and something in my head went, yeah, you need to do this. This looks fun. So, anything I can add in to get to the finish line, I'm all here for.
Sure. Okay. So it sounds like we are adding weight training.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well then, the off season and getting the weight training under the belt is going to be the first step. And then we move on to the base period, which it's critical for any racer, but I would say it's especially critical for a racer who's trying to do something like Unbound, because having a large base is important for endurance, and a 200-mile gravel race is almost all about endurance. So that'll be a critical part of your training. During that time, we're probably going to try to increase the volume on the bike. We will be throwing a little bit of intensity in there, but that won't be the main focus of that period. And then as we get into the build period, because we're doing such a long race, the build period will actually look more like the base period than it normally would. Like if you were training for a crit or something and doing a whole lot of 30-30 intervals or VO2 max intervals, we will still be doing a little bit of that, but again, we're not necessarily going to be dropping the volume down like we typically would in the build period, because we want our training to be getting more specific to the race that we're doing, and we wouldn't drop the volume to get more specific for a super high volume race like Unbound.
Yeah, I don't think that's the secret.
So I guess that's kind of
finishing 200 miles.
right. So that's kind of like a brief overview of kind of what we're looking at over the next couple months here.
Okay. What one of the things that I've used a lot in the past is just different metrics. I have different. I've had workouts that if I can nail this workout, I feel pretty confident going to a race. What kind of metrics are we looking at for something like Unbound? Because I've obviously never done anything like that before. Are we paying attention to watts per kilo, power after a certain number of kJs, kilojoules burned, repeatability? What kind of metrics should we be paying attention to?
Sure. So, FTP is important for all cyclists, and it's important for Unbound as well. If you have a higher FTP, that means your 10-hour, 12-hour power is likely going to be higher as well. But, it's not necessarily the end-all, be-all. There are certainly riders who, maybe their FTP isn't as high as another rider, but they have, superior muscular endurance, and their 12-hour power is actually higher than a person who's got a higher FTP. So, just like there's people who, they may have a better sprint, but that doesn't necessarily mean their FTP is higher by any means, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the two are not even necessarily correlated.
Yeah.
I would say that your 12-hour power and your 1 hour FTP are much more correlated than your sprint and your FTP would be. But that being said, there's other factors at play here. So we'll be looking at your FTP, and that's probably what we're going to be using to measure improvement, just because doing a 5-hour test or a 12-hour test is completely unreasonable. But there are key workouts that I'll have athletes do, and that I'll do myself to see if I'm improving my 5-hour power or my 7-hour power or my 10-hour power. Like for example, long tempo workouts, I'll kind of look to see how much tempo an athlete can handle in a single session, because that's actually during a race like Unbound, you're going to have to you're probably going to do more tempo than you've ever done in a single day on the bike in your life.
Yeah.
And if you pace it correctly, there's actually going to be very little time above FTP, or there should be very little time above FTP. Most people screw that up and they go too hard at the beginning and then they fade throughout the race. But if you're actually pacing it correctly, you should actually be staying underneath that FTP for almost the entire race. And honestly, probably not even getting close to your FTP, just sort of staying in that zone 2, zone 3, bouncing between the two, whether you're, on a climb or descent or flat section.
Yeah. Okay. That makes total sense. I don't think I'm not going to be able to hold my hour power for much longer than that. So,
right.
I did a race not too long ago that I tried to do that, and it ended poorly. So, we got to no 12-hour power tests. I'm excited. I don't think my wife would be too happy. But yeah, so let's just dive into a little bit of specifics on the different periods of training. So weightlifting is the one that I've done the least lately.
Okay.
Probably the most overall. So in a previous life, I played basketball and all the team sports and everything. So we spent a lot of time in the gym. What kind of weightlifting would we be doing for Unbound?
Sure. So the kind of weightlifting that you would be doing for Unbound is not really different from the kind of weightlifting that you would be doing for most other types of cycling, with the exception of like a track sprinter. So, and honestly, a track sprinter, there would be doing pretty similar weightlifting, except there'd be more emphasis on the gym than there would be for other cyclists. And so let me explain this. For whatever reason, weightlifting for cycling is still a somewhat controversial topic amongst coaches and athletes. There are still people that don't seem to think that weightlifting helps with cycling performance. But if you actually look at the scientific literature on how weightlifting affects cycling performance, it's not controversial. I've looked at research on all sorts of different topics, and most of the time when you do, you find that, okay, there's a handful of studies that say this, and there's a handful of studies that say that. So now, like, okay, let's look at the balance of evidence and see where it lies. Okay, I'm kind of leaning towards it says this. I'm kind of leaning towards it says that. You know, there's different interpretations with weightlifting and how it affects cycling performance. There's, in my opinion, there's one interpretation. It helps cycling performance because like 95% of the studies come to that conclusion that weightlifting helps cycling performance. And when I say helps cycling performance, I'm not talking about like it helps your sprint, which it does. Yeah. They've done studies on how it helps 5-minute power, how it helps 1 hour power, how it helps lactate threshold, how it improves endurance, that sort of thing. And a lot of these studies don't do the typical endurance lifting that you would think. And for people who are unfamiliar, endurance lifting is low weight, high reps. So, you know, you pick a weight that you could lift for, like, let's say you pick a weight that you could squat for 20 to 30 reps. That's a high number of reps. Yeah. Instead, a lot of these studies, they'll have people do 4 to 10 reps, which is pretty low. I mean, that's like what you would see bodybuilders do. And the reasoning behind this is because if you think about it, endurance lifting is kind of already what you're doing when you ride your bike. It's like you're doing a squat over and over and over and over again for the duration of your ride. In order to maximize neuromuscular recruitment, which is probably the main benefit of weightlifting to cycling performance, you actually want to do higher weight and lower reps. And so we're not gonna start with higher weight and lower reps because that's a recipe for injuring yourself, but we want to work up to that. So I might have you start with very low weight and higher reps, like in the 20 rep range with like just the bar for doing squats and deadlifts. And then we'll work up to a point where we can do 4 to 6 reps with quite a bit more weight. Because if you're doing 4 to 6 reps, you need the quad is a really strong muscle. You need a lot of weight. So that's kind of the plan there. And as far as the types of exercises we're doing, it's very lower body focused, leg focused, quad focused. We're talking squats, deadlifts, lunges, that sort of thing. Now, I'll have people throw in some core work and some upper body work, but that is very much secondary to the leg work that you're doing, because the leg work is actually physically increasing the amount of power you can produce on on your bike, and the upper body stuff is sort of there to maybe improve your upper body fatigue over the course of a long race, or maybe reduce your chance of injury or stuff like that. But it's not physically increasing the amount of watts that you can put to the pedals on the bike, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, so when we're going through that lifting, I've done this a few times where I kind of get back into lifting before, and we get, I always get some pretty severe DOMs for a week or two. What kind of riding are we doing at that point? How does that move into kind of the base phase? Just walk me through that portion.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. So, a lot of cyclists don't lift regularly, or cyclists will take a break from lifting during the season because they're racing so much. So, a lot of times in the fall, riders are getting back into the gym for the first time in a long time, and DOMS is something that they're going to deal with. And this is why I say, if you're going to put weightlifting into your training schedule, you have to do it in the off season. Because the riding that we're doing around this time is already going to be relatively low volume and low intensity. And low volume and low intensity is, I say relatively because it's relative to you. I mean, like a World Tour Pro, low volume for them is like 15 hours a week. For most people, 15 hours a week is a really big week of riding, right? Yeah. So it's relative to you. You're going to have low volume and low intensity at this time. And part of that is because you want, if you have a fairly active riding season, it's actually a good thing to have a little bit of a dip in your training, an off season. There's a little bit of research that suggests that may be a reset time for your hormones and your blood values. If you've been riding 3 hours a week, I don't necessarily know that you need that, but I think that you do need that in order to get over the DOMs that you're going to feel from the weightlifting.
Yeah. I've had about a 2-year off season, so.
Okay. Yeah. So we're going to, we'll slowly ramp up the volume of riding during that time, but it's not necessarily going to be super structured. Not necessarily going to be doing a whole lot of intervals, if any, and just doing a manageable amount of volume. And keep in mind that when you get on the bike, you're probably going to be sore from that gym session that you did.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, as we then move into kind of the base period of training, obviously, kind of the whole reason this is on. That we're doing this video portion of the training was that I work full time. I have a kid at home. I have a family. So I don't have 15, 20, 25 hours a week to train. I hate the question, what's the least amount of riding I can do to do this? But, on kind of what we see that average cyclist, I guess, available time, what kind of weekly hours are you looking at?
Yeah. So I've gotten this question before, like how few hours can I get away with, and still finish Unbound? And, the answer is honestly, it depends. And I know people hate that answer, but here's why it depends is because we all have different genetic capabilities. For example, if Matthew Van der Poel didn't ride his bike at all for the next 2 years, I think he could still probably finish Unbound, right? He maybe not
agree.
fast, but like he'd be okay, right? Versus most people, that's, if they didn't ride their bike for 2 years, that's not, they're not finishing Unbound. That's not going to happen. So there, different people can get away with different amounts of training. If I had to say, somebody shooting for a 12 to 14 hour finish, what is the average number of hours per week that those people are doing? It's probably, it's probably like 7 hours a week on the low end, and on the high end, there's probably people hitting 15 hours a week.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which I guess brings us to the question of how many hours a week do you have to play with in your schedule?
Yeah, I think that's the elephant in the room that I'm just kind of forcing some time into the schedule. So,
Sure.
I think kind of on an average, I do a pretty good job. I have the ability to do a pretty good job of getting out for a longer ride on the weekends and do a few rides during the week. If you're talking maybe, I would say probably 7 to 8, maybe 10 hours a week on the kind of on the higher end of where I can squeeze some time here and there.
Okay. I think we can work with that. What are the winters like? You're in Indy, right?
Yeah, we're in Indianapolis. So I have one race next weekend that I'm going to do, and that'll be interesting. But the road bike is set up on the trainer.
Sure.
We're about to hit daylight savings time, and it's dark when I get to work and dark when I come home. So I think we're going to be doing a lot of trainer rides here coming up.
Yeah. I mean, I coach people, and I have coached people who either they almost exclusively train on the trainer year round, or they, at least in the winter, they're exclusively on the trainer. Fortunately, that's not me. I'm almost exclusively outdoors. I can count the number of times on one hand this year that I've had to ride the trainer, which I'm very thankful for.
That's awesome.
But I totally get it. I mean, you got to do what you got to do. If there's limited light, if there's terrible weather conditions, not all of us can go ride in the middle of the day when it's super, at least relatively warm to the rest of the day, and there's ample light available. So, what I'll often do, so there's a lot of time in the base period just at zone 2 endurance, and that can get quite tedious if you have to rack up a lot of hours on the trainer at zone 2. Oftentimes what I'll do is I'll build a trainer workout that fluctuates through zone 2. So we'll go high zone 2, then low zone 2, then medium zone 2, then high zone 2, then low zone 2, medium, high, low, medium, high, low, high, it's just really, and there's no physiological reason for doing that. It's literally just to keep your attention on the trainer and have you stick in that zone 2. The other thing that I'll have people do is split up long rides. So obviously sitting on the trainer for 4 hours is quite mentally taxing, but maybe if you can do 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, it becomes more manageable. So for example, like on the online training plans that I sell, I have an outdoor version of the base training plan, and I have an indoor version of the base training plan. Those are the two differences between the two plans. Is the indoor version has these undulating zone 2 rides, and also the long rides are split into 2 instead of 1.
Okay, that was a big one. I was going to ask. I think my longest Zwift ride is north of 5 hours, so I don't want to do that. I'm not really sure why I did that day, but I think my attention span goes really, really quickly after about 3 hours on the trainer. So how does what kind of training effect is it if you train in the morning and then in the evening, or do it 2 days?
Yeah, so I actually did a video on 2-a-day training versus 1-a-day training, and unfortunately there's not a lot of research on it right now. What I would love to see is a study where they have people, they have 2 groups, and both groups do the exact same volume of training, but one group does all the rides are just 1 ride a day, and then the other group, all the rides are 2-a-days, right? And see which one performs better at the end of the study. We don't have that right now, unfortunately. There's a couple studies where they've had people split up their training for fasting reasons, which is a confounding variable. And I think that my conclusion, and they've also had studies where they've split up the training, and they've seen if there's any effect of having the two training sessions closer together versus further apart. So, for example, like training at 6 in the morning and then 6 at night versus, I don't know, 9 in the morning and then 3 in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. And actually, the closer the two training sessions were, I'd have to go back and read this study because I can't remember every detail of it off the top of my head. But the closer the two training sessions were together, the better the subjects performed, which, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, it brings you to, okay, the closest that two training sessions can be together is if they were just immediately back to back and you just did one long ride. So I'm not saying that definitively one long ride is better than two split up rides, but I would say that that's kind of where the research is leaning. And I will put the caveat there that the research is very limited.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So it sounds to me like you would recommend a periodized approach, not sweet spot. And I've seen a lot of your videos over the last couple of years, so kind of a loaded question, I think, here. But I guess just for everybody watching, why can't I just do a bunch of sweet spot? Because that's what the internet says I should do, and then I don't have to ride very far.
Sure. So you use the term periodized versus sweet spot, but I think that the more appropriate term is polarized versus sweet spot.
Polarized, right?
Yeah, because periodized just means your training is changing over time.
Yes.
And you could definitely have sweet spot training change over time and be periodized as well. But but polarized would mean that you're either at a low intensity or you're at a high intensity, and you're kind of avoiding the middle. Versus sweet spot, you're spending a lot of time in the middle. Hence that sweet spot for people that are unfamiliar. So yeah, and then there are a lot of coaches out there, and some of them are quite well known. I won't name names, although I have totally named names on my actual YouTube channel if you want to go watch. Who advocate this sweet spot approach, and when you look at, and then in a lot of their training plans, it's like when I say it's sweet spot heavy, it's like sweet spot every single day. It's like, okay, you only have 6 hours a week to train. We might as well make the most out of that 6 hours and just ride at this kind of hard intensity every single day. The thing is, this is like the same thing with the weightlifting question. If you actually look at the research, this is not a controversial topic. Almost every single study that has looked on polarization versus sweet spot, they don't call it sweet spot in the research, but they call it threshold training, because in the research they'll often divide training into 3 zones. Zone 1 being below the first lactate turn point, zone 2 being between the 2 lactate turn points, and zone 3 being above the second lactate turn point. Second lactate turn point actually being what we consider FTP. So that threshold zone is what they consider zone 2, which is sweet spot, sorta. And and that's kind of people who have limited time to train. That's where they spend most of their time training, and that's actually what the research suggests you should not do. You shouldn't just go out and ride at threshold or sweet spot every single time you get on the bike, even if you only have 6 hours per week to train. They have tested this on there's a lot of people who say, oh, well, I don't have 20 hours a week to train. It sounds like polarized works great if you're a pro, but like I can't ride that much, so I'm just going to do this sweet spot thing. They have tested this on riders who have a low training volume, and Polarized still came out ahead. So, and it's a very easy trap to fall into. But I think that even at a lower volume, it's very important that you keep a little bit of polarization in your training. Now, what I do want to say is that polarization doesn't necessarily mean that we're completely avoiding sweet spot at all costs. Yeah. And this kind of gets into the difference between polarized training and pyramidal training. So polarized training, I just laid out those three zones, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. In strict polarized training, you would spend 80% of your rides would be zone 2 rides. Almost none of your rides would be here. I'm screwing up this. So I'm talking about zone 2 in a 6-zone model. Yeah. I gotta make sure that I'm keeping models. It all in line, because this does get confusing for people. I'll just talk about it in the 3-zone model here. So I'm just so for the people listening, this is the 3-zone model I'm talking about. So 80% of your rides would be in zone 1 in a 3-zone model. Almost none of your rides would be in zone 2 in a 3-zone model, and 20% of your rides would be hitting that zone 3 in a 3-zone model. So with pyramidal training, it's very similar. It's probably 70 to 80% of your rides in that zone 1, and then you might have maybe like 15 to 20% in that zone 2, and then you'd have 5 to 10% in that zone 3. So it's a pyramid instead of polarized. They have done research. There's less research on pyramidal than there is polarized, but they have done research comparing polarized to pyramidal, and they've done research comparing pyramidal to sweet spot. And it seems like pyramidal is probably just as effective as polarized. And what I take away from that is that you shouldn't necessarily avoid sweet spot at all costs, and especially for a race like Unbound, where you're actually going to be spending time in the race at sweet spot and tempo, which both sweet spot and tempo, depending on how you define them, are in that zone 2, which strict polarized you would want to avoid. You're going to be spending time in the race in that zone, so we don't necessarily want to avoid it. We just don't want to fall into the trap where we feel like we have to do that every single day, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
In fact, you don't want to do it most days. You probably only want to hit that zone twice a week is what I usually recommend for people.
Okay. Well, I think that kind of brings me into my question, the big one in the room, because for me, right, is that I've never trained for these long events before. So specialty is always bring down the, as we're getting kind of to the pointy end for racing, bring down the volume, bring up the intensity. But I'm guessing we're not going to be doing that in April, May, right before the race. What does specialty phase look like?
Right. So now we're getting into kind of the lead into the race. So you're correct. If I was training you for crits, we would bring down the volume, and we would be doing a lot of high intensity intervals, 30-30s, VO2 max intervals, get you ready for those crit efforts. But that's not what we're doing. We're preparing for a high volume race. So instead of bringing down the volume, we're probably going to keep the volume steady, which should be a high volume at that point at the end of base season. And we're going to attempt to increase your training load by increasing intensity. Now, intensity will take a hit because your volume is still high, but we're willing to take that hit in intensity because we need the volume for Unbound, which is actually not a very high intensity event. You're riding at quite a low intensity throughout the entirety of Unbound. So this is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's more race specific to do this. So we're still going to keep your long rides in there. We're still going to keep the volume high, but we're going to try to increase the intensity, and we'll be doing a mix of race specific workouts, and a race specific workout for Unbound is going to include a lot of tempo. And it's probably going to be quite long as well. Like it's going to be both long and intense. And then we'll probably have some what I call just general intensity days. And general intensity days could be things like VO2 max intervals or 30-30s or threshold or just kind of and those are not necessarily specific to your goal, which is Unbound, but what they're doing is they're raising your FTP, which, you know, as your FTP goes up, hopefully your 12-hour power is going up as well. Usually all those things go up in tandem. So there's a little bit of research to suggest that you know, if you could take the approach of being strictly we're going to do things that are specific to your race, or you could go the route of we're going to just do things that generally increase fitness. And I think that a mix of both is actually the best method in the build period.
Okay. Awesome. One of the things that I'm sure a lot of our listeners have experienced, and I know you've addressed it a few times on your channel too. This 2-year off season has had not only a big drop in fitness, but a big gain in weight. So where does weight loss come into this plan? I don't think at my current weight, that's not where I want to be on race day. We'll put it that way.
Sure. Yeah. Weight loss is a big one. My videos on weight loss are some of the most popular videos on my channel. So there's different ways that you can go about losing weight, and different methods work for different people, is what I'll say. But the method that I usually try to prescribe to people is one that sort of centers around, it's almost like it centers around health as the primary goal. And it's weight loss is sort of secondary, but if you're eating this way, hopefully the weight will come off naturally. And what I'm getting to is if you center your diet around whole foods instead of processed foods, for example, the calorie density of the food that you're eating is going to drop quite a lot. And they've done research to show that when people are fed the same, you know, they're told they can eat as much food as they want, but one group only has access to low calorie density food and one group only has access to high calorie density food. The group that has access to high calorie density food always ends up either gaining weight or not losing as much weight, or whatever the purpose of the study is, right?
Yeah.
And it just so happens that low calorie density foods are the foods that are not processed. So we're talking about, you know, fruits and vegetables and all that sort of stuff. In fact, fruits and vegetables are, by category of food, are the lowest calorie density food that you can have. Vegetables are the lowest calorie density food just as a category. And so often what I tell people is like, if weight loss is a goal for you, you should probably actually center your meal around that and not around, you know, everything else, like the higher calorie density portions of the meal. Like, have vegetables actually take up the majority of your plate, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And just generally cut processed food out of your diet. I mean, it's going to be better for your health, which is good, but also the downstream effect of that is that you'll kind of naturally lose weight. And if your weight loss approach involves you starving yourself, you may be able to lose weight in the short term, but it's just not sustainable, because no one can live in a constant state of hunger. Your weight loss really needs to be sustainable, if that makes sense.
So you're telling me no weight loss shortcuts, no training shortcuts.
Sure.
No magic diet.
I would hope that as well. If you go from 3 hours a week to 10 hours per week, some weight will naturally come off too.
That's my thought, my hope.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I've done on and off is running. And we found that pretty quickly after we brought our son home from the hospital. It was a lot easier to put him in a jogging stroller and take him for a run. A little ways after he got home from the hospital. But how does that work with running? When is it ever okay to substitute a run for a ride? Is that just a different thing that is like I went and played basketball? How does that work into training?
Yeah, so I've done a video on cross training. It's quite an old video now at this point. I should probably update it, but I've done research on cross training. Does cross training help with cycling performance? Obviously depends on the type of cross training. Interestingly enough, the type of cross training that has the most carryover to cycling performance is cross country skiing. So for anybody who lives in a place where it snows a lot, hopefully you're getting out on your fat bike, but also if you're looking for something else to do, cross country skiing seems to have a lot of crossover with cycling. There's a lot of research on triathletes and how those three sports that triathletes do cross over with one another, and luckily running and cycling have a lot of crossover. There's less crossover with swimming and the other two. So you're probably getting less out of a swimming session if you're trying to get faster on a bike than you would out of a running session. So as far as running goes and other cross training, usually I'll have, you want your race, your training to get more specific to your race as you get closer to your race. And that could also include cross training, meaning that you do more cross training in the winter when you're far out from your race and the weather's bad and you're stuck on the trainer, and running is a good way to mix things up. And then as we get closer to Unbound, hopefully the weather improves, you can ride outside, you can do longer rides outside, and most of your training can actually be on the bike instead of having to do something else like running.
Perfect.
But the short answer to that is that we can definitely include running in the winter.
Awesome. Is there a good substitution? Is a hour-long ride a 30-minute run? Is it a 20-minute run? Or is it just, is that a SILCA's favorite answer? It depends.
Yeah, I guess Josh throws out the "it depends" answer quite frequently as well. Because it does. I mean, so many things depend, right? If somebody's giving you a blanket answer, they're probably, I don't know. There's just something's dishonest there, right? If they're just like, yes, this definitely does this. So yeah, is there a conversion like 20 minutes of running equals 1 hour of cycling? I mean, it obviously depends. And the reason why it depends is because, there are people who are more proficient at running. There are people who are more proficient at cycling. Depends on your training status. I mean, if we're talking about, it depends on the time of the season. If we're talking about like we're a month away from Unbound, I would say get out on the bike for an hour as opposed to running for 20 minutes. If we're midwinter, I'd say like if you don't have time for an hour-long bike ride, let's try to do a 20-minute run. Obviously, running is more taxing on the body, so you don't have to run quite as long as you have to ride your bike. But as far as like a simple conversion, it's really hard for me to put a number on that.
Okay. Awesome. What's the biggest or the best workout, I guess, as we get through the winter? I'm getting fitter, getting faster, being able to ride longer. What's that kind of key workout that test workout that we might be looking at?
Sure. The key workout is going to be probably what I mentioned earlier, where it's a long ride, but it's also an intense ride, and it's probably just going to be testing how long you can sit at tempo. And you can break that up in different ways, but, maybe see how many 30-minute tempo blocks you can do in one session. which will be very taxing. You'll be very tired at the end of this session, but it's kind of a good indication of, like, are we making progress towards being able to do this at Unbound? Like I said, Unbound, you're going to do more tempo during Unbound than you've probably ever done in one day in your life. So that kind of is the key workout right there.
Okay. Well, awesome. I think we have broken the record of the most training talk ever on a SILCA podcast. So we'll wrap it up there, and then I think we'll get to training and probably check back in a couple months and see where I'm at, what kind of changes we need to make, things like that. And I appreciate you coming on, and thanks for the help with the project.
Yeah, definitely. This sounds like a super fun project, and I'm psyched to be part of it. So, and it'll be cool to see your improvement. So I'm stoked.
Well, thanks to Dylan for joining us on the podcast, being able to talk about training and really kind of getting in depth of what's going to be happening over the next few months. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, you can follow me on Strava at Travis Verhoff. You can follow Dylan on Instagram at Dylan Johnson. We'll be posting more videos here, and if you want to see part 2 of the series, we'll link that in the video description, or you can click here for more videos on the topic.